Pacific Ocean. Senkyu-hyaku-40 USS Temps is pinned down 150 feet below the surface. Above, a Japanese destroyer is making its attack. Runda. Crew can hear the screws churning water. Getting closer. Closer. Then the depth charges start falling. 1, 2, 3, 4 explosions. But they're all wrong. Too shallow, too deep. The Tang's crew looks at each other in confusion. They should be dead. The destroyer makes another pass. More depth charges. More explosions at the wrong depths. Commander Richard O'Kane realizes something impossible. The Japanese are hunting them with broken weapons across the Pacific. American submarine crews are discovering the same inexplicable advantage. Japanese depth charges that consistently detonate at the wrong depths, turning what should be death sentences into survivable attacks. The Navy that built the Zero fighter and the Yamato battleship somehow Korean manufacture a working depth charge fuse. And this quality control catastrophe is about to save hundreds of American lives while dooming Japan's anti-submarine warfare to futility. The full story. When engineering excellence failed at the worst possible moment, the Pacific War was a submarine commander's chess match, played in 3 dimensions, where detection meant death and death was your only defense. American submarines, prowling Japanese shipping lanes, faced a gauntlet of destroyers, corvettes, and patrol craft equipped with hydrophones, sonar, and depth charges weapons, specifically designed to crush steel hulls and kill crews trapped in underwater coffins. By all accounts, Japanese anti-submarine forces should have been devastating. The Imperial Japanese Navy had decades of experience, well-trained crews, and a technological reputation built on producing some of the war's most sophisticated aircraft and ships. Their destroyers were fast, their sonar equipment was adequate, and their tactical doctrine for submarine hunting was sound. But somewhere in the Japanese industrial complex, something went catastrophically wrong with one of the most critical weapons in their anti-submarine arsenal. The depth charge fuse. Commander Richard O'Kane stood in the USS Tang's control room during one of their early war patrols in 1943, experiencing something that would become grimly familiar to American submarine commanders throughout the Pacific. Surviving an attack that should have killed everyone aboard. The Temps had been detected while stalking a Japanese convoy, the worst nightmare for any submarine crew. The distinctive ping of active sonar had echoed through the hull, followed by the unmistakable sound of a destroyer's propellers accelerating into an attack run. O'Kane ordered the boat deep and silent, pushing the Temps down to test depth and beyond, trying to get below the thermocline layer where temperature differences might hide them from sonar. The crew secured everything that could rattle, breathing quietly, listening to their fate approaching from above. Then came the depth charge to the rolling thunder of underwater explosions that could crush a submarine's pressure hull, rupture pipes, shatter gauges, and send boats to the bottom with all hands. But something was wrong with the attack. The first depth charge exploded well above the Tang's depth, a distant boom that rocked the boat but caused no damage. The second and third charges also detonated to height close enough to hear clearly, close enough to be frightening, but not close enough to be lethal. O'Kane glanced at his depth gauge, confirmed the Temps was at 200 feet, and realized the charges were exploding somewhere around 75 to 100 feet far to shallow to threaten a deep-running submarine. The destroyer made another pass, dropping a full pattern of charges, and again the explosions came at the wrong depth. Some detonated too shallow, others seemed to go off too deep, but none exploded at the precise depth where the Temps was actually hiding. The attack continued for over an hour, with the Japanese destroyer dropping dozens of depth charges in textbook patterns. But the Temps suffered only minor damage from the missiles, when pure luck placed a charge close to their actual depth. When the destroyer finally gave up and departed, O'Kane and his crew conducted a thorough damage assessment and tried to understand what had just happened. By all rights, they should have been dead. A confident depth charge attack against a located submarine had a high probability of inflicting fatal damage. Pressure holes could only withstand so much explosive force, and the concussion from a properly placed charge could rupture the hull, even without direct contact. But the Japanese charges had consistently exploded at the wrong depths. as if the fuses were miscalibrated or the depth settings were incorrectly adjusted. O'Kane filed a detailed after-action report noting the phenomenon, expecting it to be a one-time lucky break, perhaps a single faulty batch of depth charges, or an inexperienced destroyer crew that set their weapons wrong. But as Thames continued its patrol and survived several more depth charge attacks, the pattern repeated. Japanese depth charges kept exploding at incorrect depths with remarkable consistency. O'Kane wasn't the only submarine commander experiencing this inexplicable advantage. After-action reports from across the Pacific submarine fleet began documenting the same phenomenon. USS Wahoo, USS Silversides, USS Harder, USS Flasher boats, operating in different areas, attacked by different Japanese vessels, all reported depth charges that consistently detonated at depths that didn't match the submarine's actual position. The pattern was too widespread to be explained by isolated incidents of crew error or random equipment failure. Something systemic was wrong with Japanese depth charges, and American submariners were the unintended beneficiaries of whatever quality control catastrophe had occurred in Japanese munitions factories. The realization slowly spread through the submarine force. The Japanese couldn't make their depth charges work properly. This was baffling on multiple levels. Japan had demonstrated remarkable engineering capabilities in many areas. Their Zero fighters were legendarily maneuverable. Their long Lance torpedoes were the best in the world. Their optical equipment was superb, and their ship construction quality was excellent. The same industrial base that produced technological marvels somehow couldn't manufacture a functional depth charge fuse, one of the simpler weapon systems in naval warfare. A depth charge is conceptually straightforward. An explosive canister with a pressure-activated fuse designed to detonate at a preset depth. The technology dated back to World War I and had been perfected by multiple navies over decades. Yet Japanese depth charges consistently failed to perform this basic function. American naval intelligence eventually pieced together the probable causes of the Japanese depth charge failure, and the explanation revealed critical weaknesses in Japan's industrial mobilization. The fuses in Japanese depth charges relied on precise manufacturing tolerances and quality control that Japan's wartime economy could inconsistently maintain. As the war progressed and experienced workers were drafted into military service, replaced by hastily-trained workers, elderly civilians, and even forced laborers from occupied territories. The quality of Japanese munitions production deteriorated. Depth charge fuses required precise calibration. The pressure sensing mechanism had to be accurate enough to detonate at the correct depth, and the arming mechanism had to be reliable enough to activate when hitting the water but not detonate prematurely. These weren't incredibly complex requirements by peacetime standards, but they demanded consistent quality control and proper calibration procedures that Japan's overstretched war industries could unmaintain. Additionally, Japanese depth charge doctrine may have contributed to their Japanese anti-submarine forces often set their depth charges for relatively shallow detonations, based on assumptions about American submarine diving depths that were outdated by 1943. American fleet boats, like the Gotz class, could dive deeper than Japanese intelligence, believed officially rated for 300 feet but capable of going deeper in emergencies. Japanese depth charge settings optimized for attacks at 100 to 150 feet would naturally be less effective against submarines operating at 200 feet or more. But the fuse quality problems meant that even when settings should have been correct, the charges often detonated at unpredictable depths anyway. The combination of wrong tactical assumptions and defective fuses created a double failure that dramatically reduced Japanese anti-submarine effectiveness. The strategic implications of Japan's defective depth charges were enormous. American submarines operated with relative impunity in Japanese waters, sinking merchant shipping at rates that strangled Japan's island economy. Japan depended absolutely on maritime commerce oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, raw materials from conquered territories, troops and supplies moving between islands all had to travel by ship through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Japanese merchant marine losses mounted catastrophically throughout the war, with submarines accounting for the majority of tonnage sunk, while American submarines benefited from many advantages, including superior torpedo technology. Eventually, after their own torpedo crisis was resolved. Excellent intelligence from code-breaking and aggressive commanders, the inability of Japanese anti-submarine forces to effectively counterattack was a critical factor in submarine dominance for submarine crews. The knowledge that Japanese depth charges were unreliable provided significant psychological relief. Submarine warfare was terrifying under the best circumstances. Crews operated in claustrophobic steel tubes hundreds of feet underwater, completely dependent on their boat's integrity and unable to escape if something went wrong. The threat of depth charge attack was the nightmare scenario that every subaneer imagined during quiet watches, being trapped deep underwater while the explosions walked closer and closer, feeling the boat shudder with each detonation, waiting for the catastrophic rupture that would flood compartments and send the boat plunging to crush death. Knowing that Japanese depth charges were defective didn't eliminate the danger a lucky hit could still kill you, and the psychological stress of being hunted was still intense, but it provided a crucial edge in the mental game of submarine warfare. Commanders could press attacks more aggressively, knowing that even if detected, they had better survival odds than they would have faced against properly functioning weapons. The Japanese Navy was not unaware of the depth charge problem, but fixing it proved impossible given their industrial limitations and strategic priorities. Reports from destroyer captains and anti-submarine warfare units documented the low kill rates against detected American submarines, and some commanders suspected that depth charge effectiveness was part of the problem. But Japan faced too many critical shortages and production challenges to dedicate resources to fixing depth charge fuses when they desperately needed more aircraft, more ships, more torpedoes, more of everything. The industrial capacity required to manufacture complex weapon systems was stretched far beyond sustainable levels. Factories were being bombed. Raw material supplies were interrupted by submarine attacks on shipping, and the workforce was increasingly composed of untrained personnel trying to manufacture precision weapons under impossible conditions. Depth charge fuses were a relatively minor priority compared to producing Zero fighters or destroyer escorts or ammunition for ground forces. So, the problem persisted, and American submarines continued benefiting from an enemy whose weapons didn't work properly. Individual stories from submarine crews illustrated the life-saving impact of Japanese depth charge failures. USS Harder, commanded by the legendarily aggressive Samuel Dealey, survived multiple depth charge attacks during a patrol where Dealey deliberately stalked and sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, an unprecedented feat of submarine warfare aggression. The Harder was detected and counterattacked repeatedly, subjected to hundreds of depth charges, and survived largely because those charges consistently detonated at incorrect depths. Dealey's after-action reports noted with dark humor that Japanese depth charges seemed calibrated for a different ocean. USS Batfish survived depth charge attacks during a patrol where it ambushed and sank 3 Japanese submarines. Turning the hunter-hunted dynamic completely around, the Batfish's crew counted over 50 depth charge explosions during one attack, none of which detonated close enough to cause serious damage. USS Ochafish, which would later sink the Japanese carrier, survived depth charge counterattacks following earlier convoy attacks because Japanese charges exploded too shallow or too deep. The contrast between Japanese depth charge failure and American anti-submarine success highlighted the war's industrial dimension. American anti-submarine forces in the Atlantic used depth charges with properly functioning fuses, supported by sophisticated detection equipment, tactical innovation, and overwhelming numbers. German U-boats faced a gauntlet of weapons that worked as designed, contributing to U-boat loss rates that approached 75% by war's end. Japanese submarines in Pacific waters faced American destroyers whose depth charges exploded at the correct depths, whose sonar and radar systems were excellent, and whose crews were well-trained and experienced. The technological asymmetry worked entirely in America's favor. American submarines attacked with defective Japanese counterweapons while Japanese submarines faced the full weight of functional American antis. The depth charge fuse problem exemplified Japan's broader strategic failure in industrial warfare. Japan entered the war with qualitative advantages, in some areas superior torpedoes, excellent optical equipment, well-trained pilots, and battle-hardened troops, but lacked the industrial depth to sustain those advantages through a prolonged conflict. As the war ground on, quality control deteriorated, experienced personnel were lost and not adequately replaced, and production shifted toward quantity over quality in a desperate attempt to replace mounting losses. The result was weapon systems that looked adequate on paper but failed in practice, depth charges that didn't explode at the right depth, aircraft engines that wore out prematurely, ships with substandard steel, ammunition with defective fuses. The cumulative effect of these quality failures compounded Japan's strategic disadvantages and accelerated their defeat. For American, the defective Japanese depth charges became one of those unspoken advantages that veterans remembered with grim gratitude. They'd survived attacks that should have killed them, walked away from encounters that ended badly for their attackers, and prosecuted an aggressive submarine campaign that crippled Japanese logistics. The official histories would credit submarine success to many factors: technological advantages, intelligence, breakthroughs, tactical innovations, brave and skilled crews. But submarine veterans knew that luck played a role, and that luck sometimes wore the disguise of enemy equipment. That didn't work properly. Commander O'Kane and the crew of USS Tang pushed their advantage through multiple patrols, becoming one of the most successful submarines of the war before Tanga's final patrol ended in tragedy when one of their own torpedoes malfunctioned and circled back to sink them, a bitter reminder that equipment failure was a bilateral threat in technological warfare. The story of Japanese depth charge failure is a footnote in most Pacific War histories, overshadowed by dramatic surface battles, carrier aviation, and amphibious assaults. But for the submariners who lived through depth charge attacks and survived because weapons malfunctioned, it was a critical factor in their survival and success. The technical superiority everyone expected from Japanese engineering proved fatally flawed in one of their most critical defensive weapons, and that flaw helped American submarines dominate the Pacific's underwater war. In the brutal calculus of industrial conflict, sometimes victory comes not just from what you do, right, but from what your enemy does wrong. And Japan's inability to manufacture working depth charges was a strategic failure. That cost them merchant tonnage combat effectiveness and ultimately contributed to their defeat in a war where control of the seas meant everything.